Good evening, everyone. And tonight we're going to dive into the groups that came back from Babylon according to Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to be talking about who they were, where they were from, and we're going to dive deep into one specific group that continues on, that remains a kind of a player up through the years. Whereas with most of them, we're not going to kind of hear about them again. They're important in the Second Temple period, and then they just kind of seem to meld into everyone else. The Netinim, who we're going to talk about, are different in that way, and we'll see that they have a very interesting in-between position. And then at the end, we can kind of come back to that Yeshayahu passage, if you remember, that we talked about 2 classes ago, and say and re-examine what is Yeshayahu talking about when he talks about the role of the non-Jew and also the role of the eunuch. So we're going to kind of go back to that. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So we're going to be looking at Ezra 2, Ezra Bet, that talks about who came from the exile, came back from the exile. Now, this is parallel to Nehemiah Zion, Nehemiah 7. I'm going to move to the top here. It's not completely parallel. There are small differences, but I'm going to pretty much, from this verse here, we have pretty much a parallel, and I'm going to really kind of follow Ezra. I'm not going to go deep into the differences between the 2 parallel chapters. I am going to mention some differences between Ezra and Nehemiah talking about these groups and how Divrei Hayamim Chronicles talks about these groups. Just to remind you that Chronicles Divrei Hayamim is from later, is generally considered to be later in the return to Zion, so that we kind of see how the groups develop, let's say, in importance. So let's start with Ezra. Okay. So Ve'ela b'nei hamedina ha'olim mishvi hagola asher hegla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel levavel ve'shuvu liYerushalayim v'Yehuda ish li'iro. Okay, these are the people who were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon to Babylon, and then they returned to Jerusalem and Yehuda. Asher ba'u Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah. They came back with Zerubbabel. Here we have our good old Mordechai, who one assumes is not the same as the Mordechai in Megillat Esther. And let's just kind of skip ahead. Here we have all the different families, and I'm going to kind of skip ahead to our unusual groups. Okay, so first, our non-unusual groups, right? HaKohanim, right? We were looking at different family names, and now we're going to have the priests, right? The priests are going to be super important. They have a role, and also in this time, it's really important. The genealogical trees, the yichus. The yuchasim are very, very important to people in this period, and certainly to priests and Levites, but especially priests. So here we have all these different families of priests, and then Haleviim, the Levites, and then we have a new group, not new if you're used to Ezra and Nehemiah, but a new group that we don't usually talk about, which is Hamishorerim b'nei Asaph. Okay, Mea Esrim Ushmona. Okay, there are singers. They are descendants of Asaph, right, or the children of Asaph, and they number 128. Now, in Divrei Hayamim, we also have Mishorim, but it's not just from Asaph. Let's go here for a second. And at Divrei Hayamim, as is its wont, says that this group is essentially from the time of David. Right? It says, Vayomer David l'sarei haleviim lamid et acheihem hamishorarim. David says to the people in charge among the Levites, to set up among their brothers the singers. B'chlei shir nivalim v'chinorot u'mitziltayim mashmi'im la'arim b'kol l'simcha. Right? So they are going to kind of set up their brethren who will be singers and have all sorts of different instruments that they can play, and they will sing. However, we know that in the Torah, there is no mention really of singers as part of the temple service. And this seems to be a later addition to the temple service, as opposed to the original way it was set up. This was, certainly the second temple, they had singers. Here, this is where we have, the singers they are listed after the Levites in Ezra and Nehemiah. Here, they are mentioned to be part of the Levites. So we see how it kind of develops in Divrei Yamim. In another place in Divrei Yamim in Chronicles, it talks about them numbering in the thousands, which everyone says is an exaggeration, right? Compared to Ezra, which has them a little bit over, about 100, a little over 120. But it shows that they grew in importance as a class and as a group in terms of what they did in the temple, also in their service in the temple. And let's note that, whereas here we had in Ezra, we have Bnei Asaph. In Divrei Hayamim, we have Heman ben Yoel, and Umin Achav, and from his brethren, Asaph ben Brachiahu. Here you have Asaph. Umin bnei Merari, Achehem, Eitan ben Kushiyahu. And here we have Eitan. Now, if anyone who reads Tehillim Psalms on the regular, this should sound kind of familiar to us. We have them in the Psalms. For the Bnei Asaph, let's take a kind of a gander. Here we have Tehillim Mizmor Ayin Gimel, and this is a Psalm of Asaph. And we have actually a whole collection of Psalms of Asaph, or the children of Asaph, right? So there's actually a collection in Psalms of Asaph. And in fact, this has been considered like, okay, there actually were known singers of the children of Asaph who are both credited with singing these psalms and also credited with being in Ezra and Nehemiah, the main family of singers. What about our other names that we had in Divrei Yamim? Here we have in Tehillim Pei Tet. Okay, we have Eitan the Ezrahi, and we have Heman the Ezrahi. So in other words, these two people who show up in these specific psalms also show up in Chronicles. The question is, where do they show up first? Are they known from Chronicles and then they have Psalms attributed to them, right, as one, or are they known from the Psalms and then they're kind of taken to Chronicles because he's backdating? This is in general what Chronicles is assumed to be doing. He's backdating the singers. He's saying, I know that they're a very important class. They're part of the temple service. Clearly, they date from David HaMelech, from David. Clearly, they were set up then, right? And we also see how he's relating them to be Levites, to be Leviim. However, in Ezra and Nehemiah, they remain a separate class. In other words, maybe they are connected to the Leviim, the Levites. However, they get their Maser, their 10th, separately. In other words, they are among the Leviim, they also get their tithe, right? But they are named separately from the Leviim. So they get the tithe along with the Levites, right? And this becomes important. We're going to look at this later in the course when there's a mess up and the Levites aren't getting their tithe, and neither are the singers, right? So you need to, and Nehemiah institutes a system whereby they are going to get their tithe. And it's very important that the singers are part of that system. They are a separate group that get their payment. Yes, Cheryl.
So the whole time that they're in Babel, this group stays together as a group?
Okay. All right. So this is the question, and we're going to see that actually, possibly, maybe, right? Now, the big question is if we don't believe, okay, if we believe in Divrei Yamim and Chronicles, and actually the fact is that everyone, and this is the way it's being presented in Ezra and in Nehemiah, that people are keeping their genealogical documents. People are keeping track. Anyone who has a special role, at least, is trying to maintain that, say, okay, yes, I'm descended from him, he's descended from him, and I can show you. So, for example, let me find the verse before I jump to it. So, if you see my screen here, I'm looking in Ezra at the end in a later verse, in verse 61 of Ezra 2. ובבני הכהנים, בני חוויה, בני יקוץ, בני ברזילי, אשר לקח מבנות ברזילי הגלעדי אישה, ויקרא על שמם, אלה ביקשו כתבם המתייחסים V'lo nimtza'u v'yigo'alu min hakuna. There were priests who were descendants of Chavaya, the sons of Kots, the sons of Barzillai, that were named for the Gileadite woman who had been married. They looked for their documents and they couldn't find them. And so they were actually thrown out of the priesthood, right? Were they completely thrown out of the priesthood? Not exactly. They didn't say, well, you're liars. They just said, Vayomer hatirshata lahem, asher lo yuchlu mikodesh hakodeshim ad amod kohen lurim lutimim. The person in charge said to them, you can't eat from sacrifices until a Kohen who can cast, who can kind of understand the Urim and Tumim can ask and see that you are actually priests. In other words, until the full redemption, let's say, until the return of full prophecy and oracles with the Urim and Tumim. So the idea is that yes, people were supposedly kept their genealogical records. If they had a role and that role was important, they would try to keep their genealogical records. I'm going to go back now and let's take a look at some other people. Now the question is, for how long? Like, how far back did this go? Right? So we're going to see, for example, the Bnei HaShoarim, Bnei Shalom, Bnei HaShoarim, Bnei Shalom, Bnei Ater, Bnei Talmon, Bnei Akuv, Bnei Chanitita, Bnei Shovai, Hakol Mesh Loshim V'Tisha, 139 gatekeepers. Okay, who are these gatekeepers? All right, now Shalom is probably a shortened name from Shalemiah. They found evidence of a name Shalom, but so they are the names. Just because they don't look theophoric doesn't mean they aren't actually theophoric. They seem to be kind of some of them at least seem to be shortened versions of theophoric names. In other words, names with God's name at the end. The same way as Shovai is considered also to be a shortened theophoric name. Who are these gatekeepers? Now, in this case, it really does seem, if you look at Divrei Yamim Chronicles, it talks about these gatekeepers as well. And it says that they are, and it connects them also to the Leviim, the Levites. What's interesting is, as opposed to singers that we really don't have much evidence of in earlier, like from First Temple, like we don't have evidence of we don't have in Malachim, Aleph, and Kings, it doesn't really talk about singers. It does talk about gatekeepers, but the gatekeepers it talks about are Kohanim, are priests, Kohanim Shomrei Hasaf, the priests who are the gatekeepers, who keep the doors. So in the First Temple, it really seems like this was a priest's job, right? Whereas Divrei Yamim even says Leviim Shomrei Hasaf, the Levites who keep the doors. And when it's not, and in other places it just talks about Shoarim, the gatekeepers. It seems like there was a transfer of the job from the priests to the Levites. Now, this actually kind of shouldn't surprise us because, and we saw this, and those of you who studied Cheskel with me, already at the end of the First Temple period and into the Second Temple period, there's more and more of a division of the priests are super holy. They only do this stuff. Then the Levites do these other things. So it seems like there was a shift, like, oh no, guarding the door is not the priest's job. It's the Levites' job, right? Except it's not just the Levites' job. It's a class of Levite. Now, again, here it doesn't call them Levites. It calls them gatekeepers. So it seems like there's a class of people who are gatekeepers. Okay, now we're going to get to the people that we're going to kind of dive deep on.
Well,
Yes.
once again, what were you saying about the relationship between the names here and the names in Tehillim?
Okay, so let's take a look again. I don't want to, maybe I did that too fast. Okay. In Ezra and Nehemiah, you have who are the singers? Bnei Asaph. Okay. Now, Bnei Asaph have an entire group of psalms that are attributed to them in the book of Psalms. So it seems that there's a long-standing tradition of them being singers. They're singers, they're psalmists, right? It seems to go back at least to the beginning of the Second Temple period, if not earlier. Okay, just so you know, the academic approach to Psalms a lot of times sees the attributions, and is particularly the verse when the verse says this is what David said when he was pretending to go crazy. Those verses are considered to be quite late. They're always considered to be part of the editing of the book. These Psalms are attributed to Asaph. It does seem that they are different, that they actually have kind of a different authorship. And again, it seems like there is a long tradition of this family, this tribe, being singers, being psalmists, etc. Then you have the people that are kind of added in Chronicles. Now, just because they're adding Chronicles doesn't mean that they weren't singers, but Chronicles seems to be talking, Divrei Yamim seems to be talking about a different stage in the Second Temple period where there were many more singers. Probably not the exaggerated number that Divrei Hayamim gives us, but they were important. They had an important role, at least, and there was a large group of them. Divrei Hayamim considers them to be Levites, it seems, and they include not just, when it's talking about where are they from, it's not just the children of Asaph or the descendants of Asaph. We have two names, and if we take a look here, we have Heman ha'ezrachi, right? And we also have Eitan ha'ezrachi. They each get a psalm. Because they got just individual psalms, they are considered possibly not singers. The question is, where does the name come from? Was the name in the Psalms, in the attribution of the psalm, taken from Chronicles, or did Chronicles see this and say, oh, I need to put them in the group of singers? Which to me sounds a little bit more reasonable, maybe, that they would say, okay, there are psalms that are attributed to these guys. They must be in the group of singers. I will put them in the genealogy of the singing group. Okay, remember that Divrei Yamim Chronicles is already going way back. It's going to David. Now, the singing class almost certainly didn't go all the way back to David, but the fact that also that we're attributing them to David setting up the singers, is another connection to the Psalms. The Psalms are from David, right? I'm not putting academics aside, right? Traditionally, the Psalms are from David. David setting up the singers. Here are the names that Psalms are attributed to. Okay? Remember again that the author of the Chronicles is living during the Second Temple period when you have books of Psalms with attributions. Okay?
Miriam,
Yes.
is the big picture here that Ezra is giving us a list of all the so-called civil servants, all the people who are basically living off taxpayers' money, because there might have been a lot of people claiming the status, and he wants to make order out of chaos and say, okay, here's the list. If you're on the list, fine. If you're not, you're not.
Well, I that's a nice idea, actually, because it is true. These are people who serve in the temple. But at the same time, another reason to be very clear about who does it is that other people aren't allowed to, right? These are the people, they have jobs. Those jobs are set, right? You can't just say, oh, hey, I'm going to join the gatekeepers. No, wait a second. No, there are families of gatekeepers, right? This is their job. This is their traditional job. And I think that becomes much more of an issue in the Second Temple period. Oh, actually, I don't want to skip over. Let me.
Can I
Oh,
just
wait,
ask, what did the gatekeepers do?
They're actually given a lot of other jobs. So just a second, and I will point you to the place in Chronicles where we actually see. Here we are. So we could kind of look and see. And again, when we're talking Chronicles, we're talking later than Ezra and Nehemiah, but we also get more information. Asharim, Shalom, Vakuv, Talmud, Vachiman, Vachihem, Shalom, Harosh. Okay, so the gatekeepers were Shalom, Akuv, Talmud, Achiman, and their brother, the kinsman is the right translation here. Shalom was head. Vadhena b'shar hamelch mizracha. They were in the king's gate to the east. Hema sharim lamachanot b'nei Levi. These are the gatekeepers that belong to the Levite camp. And he said, what else did they do? What else did they do? So Divrei Yamim Chronicles gives them a wider group of things to do, right? Al Malechet Havodah Shomrei Hasipim Le'ohel Vavotem Al Machaneh Hashem Shomrei Hamavo. So they're in charge of not just, they're all obviously in charge of the Hasipim, they're guarding all the entrances, right? but they also are in charge of the work of the service, right? What does that mean exactly? We don't know, but they have a greater role than just being gatekeepers. They have some administrative role, right? כולם הברורים לשוערים בסיפים, 212 הם בחצריהם את יחסם, המה יישא דוד ושמואל הרועה באמונתם. So we see what Chronicles is saying is they were selected to be gatekeepers on the thresholds, and they were selected according to their families, right? And according to where they lived, and it was established by David and Shmuel. Now, again, this is unlikely. It really seems that in the first temple period, as we have in Melachim and Kings, it was the Kohanim, the priests, who guarded the gates and who were in charge of the entrances. But here in Devrei Yamim, it's very important for them to emphasize this is a hereditary position. This depends on your family. Okay.
And Miriam,
Yes.
maybe I missed something, but how could they be assigned at the time of David and Shmuel? There was no mikdash at the time of David and
Well, that's
Shmuel.
why it says ha'ohel. If you notice here that
Uh-huh.
he's being careful. He's saying l'ohel moed, that they're guarding the entrance to the ohel moed. In other words, Mishkan, the tabernacle, right? So he's being careful. He knew that would be a problem, right? But we, the readers, are supposed to understand that, yeah, that's our guys also. So, and we see actually what they're supposed to do. And here we have more work, more things that they're in charge of. Okay. They actually have kind of a schedule of when they serve because they've got families in their places, and then they kind of send their they send people to do their time in the temple. And it says, Ki ve'emunah hema arbat kiborei hashorim hema leviim v'yu halishakot v'al ha'otzrot beit Elohim. What are they supposed to do? They are entrusted with all the treasure and all the treasuries of the Beit Mikdash. Usvivot Beit Elohim yalinu ki alehem mishmeret vehem al hamaftech laboker. Right? They have to guard overnight because of all the precious things essentially they're in the temple. Umehem al klei havodah ki v'mispar yevi'um v'mispar yotzi'um. And some of them are in charge of the actual vessels. They're kind of like they're the ones who are in charge of kind of checking them out, right? To make sure that they're coming back the same number that they were going out. And not only that, but also I'll call kodesh, but all the vessels, but they're essentially the keepers of the materials that you need, all the food stuff that you need for the temple. So they're in charge. They're the treasurers. Now that's not the case in general. It doesn't seem in another place. Devan talked about the Levites doing this, right? That this is now that's actually not that much of a contradiction because from the point of view of Devrei Yamim, from the point of view of Chronicles, they are Levites. They're a type of Levite. So, but it doesn't seem that that's their role necessarily in Ezra and Nehemiah. And what I mean is this expanded role. And they certainly don't seem to have, you wouldn't have Levites doing this in the temple, in the first temple. In the first temple, you could give things over to priests, but you wouldn't give the treasure over to Levites. So this is a change in roles to the second temple, or it seems to be. It seems to be. So let's move on to the guys that are really puzzling. We'll go back to our chapter in Ezra. I do want to find, before I come back to the Netinim, we have a group that is called Bnei Avdei Shlomo, Bnei Sotai, Bnei Hasoferet, Bnei Fruda, Bnei Yala, Bnei Darkon, Bnei Gidel. Here are these groups of families that are the descendants of the slaves of Solomon, of Shlomo. And these people are now counted among the Jews who returned to the land of Israel, to Judea. And in fact, they have names that some of them at least seem foreign. Sotai, Fruda, Darkon, right? They don't sound like Jewish names or theophoric names. Some of them do. Bnei Shvatia, right? That's a theophoric name, a name with God's name in it, right? But a lot of them seem to be foreign names, actually. Okay. And they are considered to be the descendants of the slaves of Solomon who came to work in the temple, right? That's why we're naming them separately. And yet they're now part of kind of the returning Judeans. Similarly, we have the Netinim. Now, the Netinim are before that, and we're going to. We don't know a lot about the descendants of the slaves of Solomon. They don't show up later. The Netinim do, and that's why I want to go back now and talk about the Netinim. Okay. Ha-Netinim b'nei Tzicha, b'nei Chasufa, b'nei Tavot. The understanding is these are people who were given over to temple service, again from the other nations. Again, we see foreign names here. Tzicha, Chasufa, right? Tavot, Kairos, Siaha, Fadon, right? These are not Israelite, Judahite names. They are foreign names. And these are people who were dedicated to temple worship, right? To work in the temple. Were they slaves? There was a Babylonian class of slaves temple slaves, and some think that that's what these guys were. That these guys were essentially temple slaves, and they kept they kept their names. Now, Chagav, I actually have. This is here. We have this was found. This was found right by the Kotel. So here you actually have, this was found, as Ido pointed out, right near the Kotel. It's from the 7th century BCE. So it's very early. And it says Lichagav, right? In the Lamed is cut off, right? This is, of course, in Paleo Hebrew, right? It says Lichagav. So here we have someone who was essentially near David, right? Near the city of David, with the name Chagav and with his own seal. It's a very impressive looking seal. So this is a name that goes back, even if doesn't sound necessarily Judean, right? So here we have this class of people, the Netinim, people who were given over, apparently foreigners, who were given
Miriam?
over to temple. So we have the Netinim, and then we have the descendants of the slaves of Solomon. And then at the end, they're kind of grouped together. It says, Kol ha-Netinim uvnei avdei Shlomo, 392. So grouping them together, the Netinim and the descendants of the slaves of Solomon are 392. In other words, yeah, they seem to be the same class of people. In other words, people who were descended of slaves that were dedicated to the temple. And yet they don't seem to be slaves anymore, right? They're mentioned. Let me find the right verse. So now I'm flipping to Ezra 7:24. That's Ezra Zion Chaf Dalet. Artaxerxes is giving orders in terms of what Ezra is going to get, and it says, and that, of course, for the service of the temple. And it says, "V'luchol modein dichol kahanaya v'levaye zamaraya torayaya netinaya ufalchei beit eladina minda below va'alach la shalit l'mirmei alehom." So you are not allowed to impose a tax of any kind on any priest, kahanaya v'levaye, and Levites, zamaraya, singers, Taraya, that's the Shoarim, the gatekeepers, Netinaya, or the Netinim, right? Ufalchei betel, and anyone who serves the house of God, right? So they are grouped with everyone else who serves the house of God. You are not allowed to set a tax on them. We should note that at the end of the chapter, it says, here we are, Kol ha-kahal ke'echad, the whole community, the whole kahal, were 42,360. In other words, these groups are considered in the community. They're part of the community. They're not something separate of the community, but they are a separate group. Okay? And in fact, let's take a look in Nehemiah. Ve'ele Rashei HaMedina asher yashvu b'Yerushalayim. These are kind of the heads of the region or the province that dwelled in Jerusalem, Uvarei Yehuda, and who dwelled in the cities of Judea. Yeshvu ish b'achuzato barehem Yisrael haKohanim v'Leviim v'Netinim uvnei avdei Shlomo. These are the people who lived in their towns as heads of the province. You have the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, the Netinim, right? And the servant and the descendants of Solomon's slaves. So these two groups who started out as slaves, essentially probably slaves of the temple, are now a group within the Judean community.
How come they Shlomo, which is like, 500 years, 400 years back, why are they still separate? Like it remains the same job?
I don't think it is the same job, no. I think clearly it's not the same job because they're still separating themselves out. And what's interesting is that the Avdei Shlomo, the descendants of Solomon's slaves, servants, whatever you want to call them, they kind of disappear in terms of a separate class. But the Netinim do not. They do not. They continue on as a separate class. I think maybe I wonder if maybe they actually did merge in the end. I don't know if I doubt that the slaves of Solomon just kind of joined somewhere else. I think they kind of merged with the Netinim because it stopped being much of a distinction. But there is clearly a distinction, which we don't know. I wonder if maybe it was considered a little bit classier to come from Solomon because he goes so far back. But maybe it was the opposite. Maybe like, oh, well, it's from Solomon's slaves. I don't know. But I would think that being connected to Solomon, I would think that that's a little classier. Like, oh, we go way back. Like, what can you say to us? Like, we go all the way back. Whereas Netinim, it's not really clear when they kind of came in to serve in the temple. Yes.
Do we know
Cheryl?
when these people became Jewish?
Okay, so
And-
this is the thing.
And
Yeah. Yes.
I'm confused. I thought you had to be Jewish to serve in the temple.
Okay.
And if they're not Jewish, what did they do?
Right. Now, in
Okay.
fact, that's what people point to. Let's look at what this might explain. So let's take a look just a moment. This is in the end of the book of Ezekiel. And he gets a commandment in terms of what is it going to be like in the rebuilt temple, right? The future temple. V'amarta el Meri el Beit Yisrael, ko amar Adonai Elohim, rav lechem mikol to'avatechem me Beit Yisrael, right? God has had enough of all your abominations. V'haviachem bnei nechar arle lev arle vasar liot b'mikdashi lechalalo et beiti. V'akrivchem et lachmi chelev adam v'yaferu et briti et kol to'avatechem. What did you do? You brought foreigners, uncircumcised of heart and uncircumcised of flesh. You brought them in my temple to desecrate it. And when they sacrificed my food, fat, and blood. And they broke my covenant with all your abominations. Okay, and so I'm skipping a little. Kol amar Adonai Elohim, kol ben nechar erel lev erel basar lo yavo el mikdashi l'chol ben nechar asher betoch bnei Yisrael. It says no ben nechar, no foreigner, no descendant of foreigners. You could actually read it as a descendant of foreigners, and that's the word that he uses. Bnei nechar, descendants of foreigners. Ben nechar, descendant of foreigners, who is uncircumcised of heart and uncircumcised of flesh, should come into my temple, right? No descendant of foreigners who is among the people of Israel. Ki ima leviim asher rachakum elai, b'tot Yisrael asher ta'u me'elai acharei giluleihem v'nasu avanam. No, just the Levites, the Leviim, they're the ones who should serve in the temple. What is this speaking against? Now we have an idea. Remember, Ezekiel's at the end of the first temple period. What it seems to possibly be speaking against are people who were brought in to serve the temple. Now you've got a class of people like this, and that's what they do. And Ezekiel's like, no, not when it's rebuilt. Not when it's rebuilt, and they can no longer do that. Okay.
Miriam?
So in fact, yes.
I'm a little bit confused. By coming into the temple, what it seems to be talking about here is to serve in the temple, but it still seems to be barring these people from even entering the temple as regular people.
Yeah, right. And that's also a thing of, could they go to the temple at all? Could they be allowed into the temple at all? I see that I'm coming to the very end of the hour. what we're going to do is let's take this time to revisit our verse in Yeshayahu. And then in our next class, we're going to look at how this plays out later in the Second Temple period, because the Dead Sea Scrolls has a reference to these guys, and then the Mishnah has a reference to these guys, and we'll see what happens in terms of what could they or could they not do. So it doesn't end with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei Yamim. The Netinim keep on going as a separate class that causes halachic issues. Because on the one hand, they are kind of part of Israel, and on the other, they are kind of not. In a way that's actually different from what we're reading here in Ezra and Nehemiah, because if you were just going to read in Ezra and Nehemiah, you're like, okay, this is a group of Jews. They apparently came originally from foreigners, but they essentially converted. After all, they're serving in the temple, right? And yet this class of people becomes an issue. Is the problem that this class of people don't get, like the way Yechezkel's talking about it, the way Ezekiel's talking about it, it sounds like they don't circumcise themselves, which would create an issue, right? But is that what's going on as the generations continue? That's hard to know. But we're going to be talking about how this group plays out later on. But before we do, and to end the class, I want to now revisit our verses in Yeshayahu, and I will open it up. Just give me a second.
Just one more question. This might be a loaded question, but what is the connection between these types of people and what the Chumash refers to as Gerim?
Okay, so let's say a little bit about that. Okay, what the Chumash calls Gerim are people who are dwelling in the land already, and they're around you. They're connected to you just because you've got to make sure that they get justice, right? And you have to make sure that they're taken care of, right? You have to care for the ger, and we are going to look at a little bit of the use of that word later on as well in our next class, but not so much. That's not going to be the focus. So it's what we call a ger toshav, right? What we call a ger toshav, right? Someone who is not converting, but they are living in the land of Israel. Because they're living in the land of Israel, they're living essentially among you. You have to make sure that they're doing okay. You're not allowed to oppress them. You have to make sure that they get justice. You have to make sure that they're taken care of, because they don't have families to help them, because they're essentially alone in your land. So you have responsibility towards them. They are not necessarily converts. We're going to, in our next class, we're going to look at people who are much closer to what we would call converts, right? In other words, people who say yes, or actually no, let's look at it now. Let's look at it in Yeshayahu, because what Yeshayahu is talking about are people who we would call converts. So let's take a look. So I'm revisiting these verses that we looked at 2 classes ago. Okay. We have here we are. I'm in Isaiah chapter 56, Yeshayahu Nun Vav. Okay. And I'm skipping to verse 3, Pasuk Gimel. V'al yomar ben hanechar hanilva el Adonai lemor havdel yavdileni Adonai me'al amo v'al yomar hasaris hein ani etz yavesh. So the foreigner or descendant of foreigners, or member of the foreigner class, because a ben nechar can also just mean a member of the class, right? Who has joined God, is one of the he's nilveh to God. He's joined God. And he says, God has separated me from his people. Why? Because he is separate. He's not actually one of the Israelites / Judahites. V'al yomar hasaris hein ani etz yavesh. Right? And the eunuch shouldn't say, why would I be a withered tree? Why are we putting the eunuch together with a foreigner? I talked about before, like, oh, the eunuch says, I don't have a future. That is true, but what is keeping the eunuch from worshiping God? Why does Yeshayahu Isaiah need to talk about this? Well, let's look at Dvarim Chaf Gimel, Deuteronomy 23. Okay, Lo yavo pitzua daka uchut shavcha b'kal Hashem. Right, a person whose testes are crushed or whose member is cut off cannot be admitted into the congregation. Now, according to rabbinic halacha, what does it talk about? He can't get married. That's what he's saying. That's what it means. It means he can't get married. However, what Yeshayahu is reacting to is not he can't get married. It's that he can't join the people of Israel at all. And it's saying, no, you can. You can. Not, you can absolutely worship God the same ways. Or so the foreigner was like who's being separated. Also, he can't be in the community of God, right? And the eunuch also says, I'm a withered tree. So on the one hand, he also doesn't have descendants, right? But he says, Kichol amar Adonai lasarisim asher yishmeru et shabtotai uvacharu b'asher chafatzti umachazikim b'vriti v'natati lehem b'veiti uvachomatai yad vashem tov mibanim uvanot shem olam eten lo asher lo yikaret. And what's happening here, what seems was possibly happening here, is actually twofold, right? It says, keep my Shabbat, choose what I wanted, hold fast to my covenant. In other words, be eunuch, you eunuch who in theory you can't be part. I'm telling you, just keep the mitzvot, keep God's law, do what I want, and I will give you in my house and in my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. You can't have sons and daughters, but you can do this. You can do this. You can join in the worship of God and be part of that. And that is how you will be able to join. Uvnei hanecher hanilvim al Adonai lisharto ulavad shem Adonai liyoto lavadim kol shomer Shabbat mechalot machazikim b'vriti. Now that we read a little bit about the Netinim, we have a better idea of what we're talking about here. Those foreigners who join God to serve him and to love the name of God, to be his servants. Everyone who keeps Shabbat and holds fast to my covenant, v'aviotim el har kodshi v'simachtim b'beit tfilati olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzon al mizbechi ki beiti beit tfilah yikareh lechoamim. I will bring them to my holy mountain. I will make them joyful in my house of prayer, and their sacrifices will in fact be desired on my altar, because my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. In other words, what the eunuch gets, the eunuch says, no, God's like, my house can include you. And in itself will be a monument to you as good as sons and daughters. To these foreigners, like, no, you can sacrifice. This is Isaiah against Ezekiel, right? Yeshayahu versus Yechezkel, right? So that what you have here is an idea of what is the status of these people who seem to be cast out. Now, again, rabbinically, the problem with the eunuch is he can't marry, which you can actually understand why a rabbi would say a eunuch can't marry, because, there are reasons, right? There are kind of obvious reasons, as opposed to the eunuch can't be part of the people of Israel. But it absolutely seems that what is Yeshayahu Isaiah talking about here in 2nd Isaiah, right? He's actually saying, no, you don't cast out the eunuch, right? No, he absolutely can be part of the worship of God, part of the people of Israel, right? And these foreigners who are meant to serve in the temple can serve in the temple. Now, absolutely, in Ezra and Nehemiah, it sounds like they are serving in the temple. In Ezra and Nehemiah, it's absolutely, remember Artaxerxes' letter. All these guys don't get taxed because they're serving in the temple, so they don't pay a tax, right? So they are serving in the temple, but it seems that later on, at least, this is no longer true. And at least there's an argument about it. We see from Yechezkel.
Who is
so-
first? Yechezkel? Is
What?
Yechezkel
Yes,
second?
yes. Well, I mean, if we say it's 2nd Isaiah, right? I am reading in the second
Second
Isaiah, I
Isaiah.
have to say. So it's Yechezkel is earlier. Yechezkel is the end of the first temple. And then 2nd Isaiah or 3rd Isaiah is into the second temple period, right? The return to Zion. So, but you can see that there's still this idea. There's no reason for us to have this prophecy if there wasn't this idea that no, they can't serve in the temple, right? Now you can say, well, how can they serve in the temple? Well, first of all, at this point, like certainly later in the second temple, there are absolutely converts, right? Later in the second temple period, there are groups of converts, right? The Idumeans, there are groups of converts, some forced, some not. And these people are descendant of people who had essentially joined Israel. So you could say, okay, they are now they're a different class, and yet we'll see in our next class that this group of people still create they are still a separate class, and there is still this back and forth about where what is their status?
Miriam, can we
Yes.
speculate on why there was a shift between Ezekiel banishing them and second Isaiah including?
It's part of the whole attitude. It very much matches the attitude of Yechezkel and the attitude of second Isaiah. So the attitude of Yechezkel is things have to be super holy and things need to be super separate. And not only should only Levites deal with sacrifices, only the Kohanim who are descendants of Tzadok can do the stuff that beforehand all the Kohanim could do. In other words, Yechezkel is saying everyone has everything more and more separate and more closed groups get to do things. So that's Yechezkel's whole attitude, right? Now, and it's not surprising that somebody would say, oh, look, they're the descendants of foreigners. Why are they serving in the temple? They should not be. And they aren't supposed to, right? Like if you read, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say they aren't supposed to. There are groups of, if we're going to see in our next class, if they're connected to the Givonim are not supposed to be a full member of the Jewish people. If you say they're not Givonim and they're just from surrounding nations that weren't part of the inhabitant nations, then you can say, well, why can't they kind of convert? Okay, but and it's very possible that's Yeshayahu's attitude. That's Isaiah's attitude. Hey, these are essentially they're converts. They're converts, right? And so they can join.
Miriam?
Yes. But Yeshayahu, Isaiah in general, has a kind, welcoming, universal, inclusive attitude. That's the second Isaiah kind of thing. So it's not surprising that we would read it. It is surprising because it takes it quite far, but that is part of its whole kind of attitude. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
these psukim from Yeshayahu, they really fly in the face of these Talmudic teachings, admittedly not my favorite, from Masechet Nedarim and Masechet Avodah Zarah.
Oh, we're going to read
We're
going to read lots of stuff that it flies in the face of. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Indeed. And we're going to see that in our rabbinic sources, there's a much harsher attitude towards this group of Netinim, and yet they are still a class within the wider Jewish people.
Now, another question, would it be fair to say that Ezra and also Nehemiah belong to the same party as Yechezkel, relatively to second Isaiah?
No, I don't think in this case
No?
they do actually. Why? Because both in Ezra and Nehemiah, at least in the book, these Netinim are serving the temple. They serve in the temple. It's very clear that when Artaxerxes sends Ezra and he says, okay, you're getting this money and these groups of people aren't being taxed because they work in the temple, right? And one of the groups are the Netinim and another one of the groups are the descendants of the slaves of Solomon, of Shlomo.
I was thinking about the intermarriage. Okay.
Okay, intermarriage. Now note that Isaiah isn't talking about intermarriage at all here. It's just not his issue here.
Right.
Who knows what he thought about intermarriage? Maybe he wants to think that it doesn't exist because that would create problems, right? He's talking about descendants of non-Jews who want to serve in the temple. He's just not talking about intermarriage. Now, you could say, well, if he says that, then clearly he'd be okay with intermarriage. I actually don't think you can draw that, right? Like it could be, but I don't think you can say that. At the same time, marrying this is important actually. So this is something I didn't bring up. Guys, stick with me for just a moment. I want to share one more text. It's very quick. All right. So I'm reading now in Nehemiah at the end of the chapter where he's talking. Let's actually go flip to the very beginning. Okay. This is the treaty that everyone signs that they are not going to marry foreign women. Okay. This is in Nehemiah. We're going to talk about this treaty more in depth at another time. But at the end, he says, Ushar ha'am ha'kohanim ha'leviim ha'shoarim ha'mashorim ha'netinim v'chol ha'nibdal me'amei ha'aratzot el Torat ha'Elohim nishehem b'neihem u'vnotehem kol yodea mevin machzikim al achehem adorehem, etc. Okay, so everyone's coming into this covenant. Who does that include? It includes the nation, the priests, the Leviim, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Netinim. Right? And every kol hanivdal me'ameriton, who separated themselves from the peoples of the land in order to follow the Torah of God. So the Netinim, like everyone else, needs to separate from the people of the land. They also can't intermarry because in Ezra and Nehemiah, they are simply part of the Judeans who have returned, and they have a special role in the temple. Now, no one can intermarry, right? But the Netinim also cannot intermarry. So note that we understand better now why Yeshayahu, why 2nd Isaiah doesn't even talk about intermarriage when it's talking about these people. It's not even an issue. That's not the issue here. It will be an issue for the rabbis later, right? But it's not an issue here. The issue, they are among everyone else. They're not allowed to intermarry, right? They're not allowed to intermarry with the people of the land, people of the surrounding nations.
But are they allowed to marry Jews?
Okay, so in this context, we don't hear they're not allowed to marry Jews. We will read rabbinic texts which address are they allowed to marry Jews or not. We'll see what status they have there. And we're also going to see things that talk about who can come into the temple precinct, which is a separate issue. And we're going to see what happens kind of in the Dead Sea Scrolls with that. So thank you all for joining me. And please be sure to join me again next week for the continuations. We look at how this kind of plays out through the Second Temple period and in the early rabbinic period.